favorezca nuestros esfuerzos, que haga desaparecer todos los miedos. No tengas miedo, yo voy contigo. Allí aprendió San Pablo a decir también, si Dios está con nosotros, ¿quién contra nosotros?
The rich had enslaved El Salvador, and the poor had begun to stumble under the weight of their yoke. Millions of Salvadorans were impoverished and oppressed because the greed and arrogance of the oligarchy of 14 families. These 14 families ruled over the country as if it were their own private fiefdom. Less than 2% of the population controlled 57% of the nation's usable land. 60% of babies were dying at birth due to malnutrition. Death was free and life was being strangled. The overwhelming amount of suffering felt by the Salvadoran people began to weigh on Bishop Romero, who up to this point had been a timid and non-controversial figure in the church. There was substantial unrest at this time. A few farm workers and laborers saw armed revolution as the only viable recourse. But the vast majority of Salvadorans were turning to the non-violent social teachings of the church, and they formed small Christian communities that sought to reform the country in light of the Gospels. However, the 14 ruling families branded these communities as communistic and ordered the military and their mercenary soldiers to shoot strikers, union organizers, and especially to target teachers, students, nuns, and priests. This left the country on the brink of civil war as Romero was made Archbishop of San Salvador, much to the delight of the government and the aristocracy. They were all happy to see the safe and silent Romero take power. However, what they failed to realize was that the Archbishop had undergone a profound metanoia that had transformed him from a timid advocate of non-controversial virtues into a fierce guardian of the faith and of the faithful. The powers that be received a full display of how tall this tower for the poor really was when his best friend, Father Rutilio Grande, and some workers were murdered. Romero demanded that the president investigate the injustices thoroughly. When his appeal for justice was ignored, Romero decreed that no longer would any representative of the church appear with government leaders at public ceremonies. And the following Sunday, he canceled every mass throughout the entire archdiocese, all except for a single mass on the steps of the cathedral as a sign of solidarity with the church, who was mourning the loss of her priests. More than 100,000 people attended. Romero sent a clear message. The church would not support a government that either directly or indirectly kills priests and the poor. He started to ask this now famous question: what can the church do for the poor? He tried reaching out to President Carter and pleaded with him to stop military aid to El Salvador because he knew they would only use it to kill his people. But his pleas were ignored and shipments of money and weapons increased. The archdiocese nearly went bankrupt from donations to the poor. All attempts to receive international aid failed. Finally, Archbishop turned his attention directly to the soldiers and policemen.
Hermanos, son de nuestro mismo pueblo. Matan a sus mismos hermanos campesinos. Ningún soldado está obligado a obedecer una orden contra la ley de Dios. En nombre de Dios, pues, y en nombre de este sufrido pueblo, les suplico, les ruego, les ordeno en nombre de Dios, cese la represión.
The next day, Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated, fittingly at the altar while celebrating Mass in the chapel of Divine Providence Hospital. Only moments before, he had said in his homily that those who surrender to the service of the poor through love of Christ will live like the grain of wheat that dies. The harvest comes because of the grain that dies. And we know that every effort to improve society is an effort that God blesses, that God wants, and that God demands of us. Romero planted seeds of liberty and hope. He spoke to the humanity of his people and revealed to them their own infinite dignity by his own blood, and like the sun, illuminated beautiful things, but also those we would rather not see. The voice of Archbishop Romero condemned the darkness of oppression and death, but his blood proclaimed the beauty of freedom and life.
Esta es la gran enseñanza del Evangelio y de los episodios de hoy. Caminar con Cristo. Y si la muerte nos alcanza caminando con Él, no hay nada que temer. La muerte es victoria para aquellos que creen en el Señor. El que me sigue no muere, sino que tendrá vida eterna.